So this is the beginning of the documentation of the motor swap I'm doing in my 77 GMC. So the 350 motor that's currently in it, one of the rod bearings is starting to go and it's spinning and knocking occasionally, especially when it gets hot. So to avoid completely ruining the motor and that sort of thing, and given the fact that I need this truck as a daily driver, what I've done is I've got a replacement, freshly rebuilt, or reasonably freshly rebuilt 350 Vortec that I'm going to swap out and put in the truck. So more modern engine, better head and engine flow design, more power, all of that sort of thing. So it's going to get essentially a new motor in it. So to begin, as you can see, the stairs in my garage originally had come out to that wall, so I needed to do a big job to narrow the stairs for the landing in my garage so I could actually get my truck in here. It's not a very big garage, so space is at a premium. So with the stairs moved, I'm able to get the truck completely in the garage, so if it rains, hails, all of that sort of thing, I'm working in somewhat comfort. Anyway, certainly not getting rained on. And to begin my project as well, I organized all of my tools. I got out all of the tools I think I'm going to need for the job, organized them nicely on the cart so they're easy to move around, keep all my tools in one spot so I don't land up losing anything and spending half of my time looking for bloody tools. So made a nice tool cart, cleaned up an area here so everything's nice and organized in the garage. So step number one, this engine hood needs to come off to get me much better access to the engine bay. Since I'm pulling this thing myself, it's just a lot easier with the hood off. So I'm going to, in combination with my cherry picker, take the engine hood off. So to get the engine hood off by myself, I set up the cherry picker with some chains there on the engine hood. So as I undo the two mounting bolts on each bracket hinge for the engine hood doesn't come slamming down. And I also put a bunch of extra shop rags between the engine hood and the windshield. So if when I unbolt it, it starts to slide backwards, it's going to hit the shop rags and not actually damage my windshield. So I'm going to get it loose and then make sure that it's balancing properly and not going to go flying into my windshield, and then completely remove the bolts and use the hoist to help me lift the hood off myself. Also, of course, when you take the engine hood, you have to remember to disconnect the windshield washer lines as well from your windshield washer pump. So off she comes. So now I've removed all of the bolts and only the cherry picker is holding up the engine hood. Also note that I used a grease marker and I marked where the hinges went before I actually removed the bolts. So when I put this back by myself, it'll be a lot easier to line up nicely when I go to put the engine hood back on. And you can see here the engine hood is loose and lifting from the hinges. Cherry picker is basically holding it up, so now I can just gently manage this end up and around the truck and take it to that part of my garage. So easy way to do an engine hood by yourself. So now I have the engine hood off. I use the hoist to place it off to the side. And what I like to do as a practice is to put the bolts back where I got them. It just avoids having to try to hunt them down later on. So whenever that's possible, I like to put the bolts back. So the next step now, I'm going to make a detailed video of where all of the hoses and such run. So that way when I go to put the accessories, the carburetor, etc., water pump onto the new motor, I know exactly how things went on this one. So the next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to drain all of the coolant from the system. I think the easiest way to do that is the lower rad hose down here. I'm going to disconnect it from the water pump, and that's going to cause basically the block to drain as much as possible, as well as the radiator to drain as much as possible. So I'm going to put a large plastic basin underneath to catch it all, so the water pump connects lower rad hose to the radiator, and then from the top of the water pump, one of the ports goes into the heater core, and the heater core comes back into the motor near the coolant neck, and then of course I got the coolant neck and the upper rad hose. So somebody just built a janky hose. I'm going to put all new hoses on here. I'm going to put a new water pump on here, probably going to put a new starter on here. I am going to reuse these exhaust manifolds. This would be an opportune time to put headers on it, but it's a lot of extra expense for really not much reason at this point. So fluids are going to be out, and then I'm going to work at removing all of the accessories, the alternator, the power steering pump, and I'm just going to lay the power steering pump up to the front and to the side here. I also see I have a small leak on the power steering return line, so that'll be a good opportunity to address that as well, and we'll go from there. So here she goes. Alright, so as far as a status update, I took off the alternator. Always, of course, remember to disconnect the power. So power is disconnected. Removed the alternator, took off the power steering pump and kind of laid it forward to the side. And then once all of that was done, you can get the power steering and the rest of the alternator brackets off. I removed the coolant hoses, the top hose, the bottom hose for the pump, as well as the hose that goes from the top of the radiator to the top of the motor. And once again, all draining into a catch basin at the bottom. A very large catch basin, so that way it can dribble all over the place and just make it into the basin and not all over the garage floor. And then, of course, I removed the fan shroud and the water pump to give me lots and lots of room here to deal with working the motor out. I disconnected the fuel line from the fuel pump, and I put a plug in and tightened it so I don't have to worry about fuel leaking down and that sort of thing. So the next step now is I'm going to disconnect all of the throttle linkage, disconnect the ignition and ground wires that are connected to the motor, and then that's it from the top. And then from the bottom I need to disconnect the block heater. I'm going to disconnect the exhaust manifolds at the flange and leave the manifolds on the engine when I pull it. So there's a manifold flange there at the back. I'm going to heat those bolts and remove the exhaust pipe from those flanges. And then once all of that is done and the ground wires are off and the linkage is off and the ignition cables are off and that sort of thing, the last thing to do will be to get into the bell housing and take the torque converter bolts out, and then the bell housing bolts out. So definitely more to go, but it's coming apart nicely. Nice thing about these old trucks is there's a lot of room to work. So for the next round of work to get the motor out, I'm going to remove all of the linkage and all of the wiring that's connecting the motor to the vehicle. And then I'm going to go underneath and begin the process of disconnecting the transmission from the motor and disconnecting the motor mounts, and should be ready then to pull the engine. So working underneath the motor, took the bell housing cover off of the bottom of the vehicle, 4 bolts holding it on. The only issue was removing the starter before that, so I could actually get the housing out. Removed the flanges and from the exhaust to separate the headers, and now need to, not sure if the video is going to show it, but the wiring harness connecting to the starter, etc., is bolted onto the bottom of the motor and actually has hangers to hang the transmission cooling lines, so those have to come out. And then on the other side there's hangers of similar sort for the block heater cord, which have to come out. So basically once that's done, then I'm going to remove the spark plugs for the motor turn the motor around and remove the torque converter bolts from the flex plate. And then for the engine mounts, I'm going to remove the actual mounts that connects directly to the frame, since those seems to be the bolts that are likely going to be the easiest to get at. So I'm going to remove those and then hoist up the engine after I support the transmission and remove the bell housing bolts. So I'm not sure how well this video is going to turn out. The lighting is poor and it's pretty dark under here, but that'll probably be the last video from under the vehicle, first and last, since it's pretty hard to record under here. So I got the motor mount bolts out. I took the mounts off from the frame here, and then the frame mounts from the cross member there on either side. I figured those were definitely the easiest bolts to get to. Plus, when I mount the mounts on the new motor, it'll make lining up considerably easier and that sort of thing. So I went that route. So now I'm going to remove the spark plugs so I can turn the motor over with a breaker bar, and I can disconnect the torque converter and transmission, and then we're ready to pull. So we have success. The motor has been successfully lifted out of the truck, as you can see. So now I've got an opportunity to clean that all up in there and that sort of thing. The old engine was leaking oil, so I can clean it all up and that sort of thing. I might have to get a new torque converter. The reason is I've got the replacement motor is a Vortec, and the center hole on the flex plate flywheel is a little smaller than on this one, so I'm going to have to take some measurements to see if that is going to fit inside the flex plate for the Vortec motor. If not, I'll need a different torque converter to make it match. The real challenge in getting the bell housing bolts out is they are in very difficult to reach places. So I used every single extension that I have. I linked all of the various extensions together, and I put a U-joint knuckle at the end with the socket, of course, 9/16 socket. There's all of the bell housing bolts, and that allowed me to break them all loose and twist them out. Then from a transmission support perspective, I put a ratchet strap between the frame rails and the transmission and tightened it, of course, before I removed the motor. I also put a floor jack under it for added protection, and just in case I need to adjust the height up or down as I put the new motor in. So the transmission's nicely supported and it'll be fine as it is. So the next real thing to do now is prep the new engine and move the accessories from the old engine to the new engine. So I'm going to take off the intake manifold, clean it all up, vacuum everything out, make sure it's good. It's got an extra water port here in the front, so I might have to get a Vortec water pump for it as well. I'm going to do some research into that. But now it's pretty simple. It's easier work now that everything's out. You know, taking the carburetor off, putting it on there, putting the distributor on there, putting the exhaust manifolds on there, putting the engine mounts on. And as you can see, the engine mounts, these are were the easiest bolts to get to. If I had tried getting the ones from under here, I've got to hold this nut from the top, screw from the bottom, and this is a very tight clearance between the frame, as you can see, the frame and this bolt. So this was the easiest to do. There was no way I was going to get at those bolts actually connecting it to the motor. So now that they're off, I can easily do all of that. And of course the fuel pump, got to take my accessories pulley off and put it on the new motor and that sort of thing. So fun and much easier work now. Not the tough job pulling it out of the vehicle. So I've bolted up almost all of the accessories onto the new motor. I had to go to the junkyard to get a proper dipstick for the Vortec block, as the one that was on the motor in the truck was on the other side and much higher in the block than this Vortec style. Took the opportunity to paint up all of the, the accessory pulleys and that sort of thing. Installed my fuel pump, etc. Put the intake manifold on, torqued everything to spec, and went to install the exhaust manifolds for my old motor, and realized that the Vortec one is actually slightly larger. And when I say slightly, I'm talking maybe a 1/16 of an inch, something like that. Very little, but enough that there's no way the exhaust manifolds are going to go from the old truck onto the new one, even though the exhaust ports appear to be the same size. So now I've got to go back to the junkyard, back to the Vortec I got the dipstick out of, and take off both exhaust manifolds and bring them back. So I decided as well to continue with the mechanical oil pressure gauge. There's a quick disconnect up here. Now that I know where it is, it's going to be really easy to deal with. So I just installed that. Harmonic balancer is on, painted that and scrubbed all the rust off of it and painted it up, put it on. Once again, it was the harmonic balancer I got from the engine builder, as this one has a smaller center opening than the original one did, just slightly different. So that's all on there. Distributors in, and advanced timing is set, so we're really good to go. Also, my carburetor from the old motor would not go onto here. It's the wrong size. It's wider and narrower, so it's more of a round peg into a square hole. So I'm going to go now to see if I can, well, maybe get an adapter. I highly doubt it though. Probably have to get a different carburetor for it as well. So the fun continues. Putting a 20-year-old motor, brand new 20-year-old motor, into 40-year-old truck is going to take some finagling. Also, when I do get the different carburetor, the linkage for the kickdown for the transmission is, I'm going to have to modify the bracket for it. So I got at the junkyard, I predicted that and got it at the junkyard last time for the different Vortec. So I'm going to have to cut this down, weld a piece on. I'm going to have to fabricate something to make that work, but I'm not going to fabricate anything until I get a proper carb that fits on there so I can adjust it accordingly. And yes, I know this is way too close. It needs to be out here. I just moved it in so it wouldn't interfere with the lift chain. So anyway, the fun continues, friends. So I now have the new motor ready to go to the point of being installed. So I've added, of course, the carburetor, the new fuel lines. Basically, it's a brand new carburetor. It's got a dual inlet fuel line, so I got some pressure hose that I'm going to run down to the fuel pump there with this extra line. I'm not going to cut the line and install the fitting on this end though until I get all of the accessories bolted onto the engine and I see exactly where I have to route this around the accessories to get down to the fuel pump. So because I don't know what that route's going to be yet, I'm just going to leave this loose. Then once the motor's in, I've got to put in the thermostat sending unit for the new thermostat gauge that I've got. I've got to create a bracket here to basically hold the throttle cable as well as the transmission kickdown cable. So there's plenty of access points to attach it to here. Got the throttle cable here. Kickdown cable will go somewhere probably around this area, we'll see once it's in. And then I've got to get a couple more short bolts. My old carburetor had 2 short bolts and 2 really long bolts, so I have to get 2 more short bolts. Then to this vacuum port here, this is where I'm going to plumb the power brakes from. And then this port here for vacuum is where I'll run the transmission kick down to. So it's coming together well. It's ready to go into the truck now. Flywheels on, torque down, that sort of thing. It's got oil in it. The spark plugs are all in it. The headers are on it, exhaust headers. Well, exhaust manifold, not really headers, but had to get from the junkyard Vortec specific. So this is an early Vortec, like a 96, 97 Vortec motor. And the distance between this end bolt and this end bolt is about a 16th or so too short, almost an 1/8 too short. So had to get these headers from the junkyard. So of course when I did that, I had to basically cut the pipe off because these bolts were so rusted I couldn't get them off. So I just sheared them off, drilled holes through them, and then I'm just going to use standard bolts to connect the two. So if they ever rust on again, I just shear the bolt off, it pulls apart, and all is good with the world. So there we go. It's going in the truck tomorrow. Got stuff to do today for the rest of the day. And as you can see, the truck is ready to accept the new motor. I hung all of the wiring harness and various wires that I need access to the windshield washer arm, just so they don't get pinched or cut or in any way interfered with as I'm trying to get the motor in there gently. Got all the starter wires, that sort of thing. It's a very old truck, so the wiring is extremely simple, thank goodness. The most complicated part now is going to be getting in the engine and then making the bracket for the throttle table. It looks like there's 2 throttle cables there, but one of the cables is actually for this cruise unit, factory cruise, that I'm tearing out because I will never use it and it's just getting in the way. I'd like to be able to sit on that fender while I work inside the motor bay, so that cruise control unit is going to be removed and kept in a box somewhere. So there we go. So new motor's in and a bunch of accessories are hooked up. I got the carburetor mocked up on the top and with the fuel line going down that I'm going to cut to length. I have an issue here getting around this heater hose. It should be able to sneak around as both hoses are flexible. Worst case, I'll have to put a spacer in here to increase the carburetor height a bit to give a bit more clearance here. The exhaust manifolds, as I already mentioned, for this Vortec motor are different, and an issue I had is you can see how close it is to the frame there. When I first put them in, it was actually just slightly touching the frame, and I was concerned when the engine's running and moving side to side, it's going to hit the frame and make a clunking noise. So I took my cutting wheel and I actually cut it to give it room to move without hitting the frame there. And they exit in a slightly different spot than the other one, so I'm going to have to modify the exhaust pipes as well, do some cutting and welding there. Not a big deal, I'm going to do that last. I've got the power steering pump connected, I got the water pump connected, I've got the pulleys on, drive pulleys on, the fan, the shroud around the radiator is on. So what's next is I'm going to do the lower rad hose. The lower rad hose from the pump to the bottom of the radiator. I'm going to put that on next since I have lots of room to get to it right now. Then I'm going to put the alternator on, put all of the heater hoses on, upper rad hose on, and then check my clearance on this. Do a little cutting and make a fitting to go and put the fitting on to my fuel pump. Then once that's done, the last remaining thing is to fabricate a bracket to hold my throttle cable and my throttle cable here and transmission kickdown cable. I've got some existing ones that I'm going to cut up and do some welding and make it fit nicely so I can connect it to the throttle assembly. Once I do that, button up the exhaust, she's ready to fire up and hit the road finally. Thank God. I need a vehicle, and this old girl's going to have a brand new heart in it, and it's going to be operational very soon. So I'm starting to fabricate the kickdown bracket cable to hold the transmission kickdown. So this is a bracket I pulled off an old Vortec motor in the junkyard. So I fashioned that to my block. I cut the side down so it fits properly. I'm still going to shave a little bit off close to the valve cover, but right now I'm basically building a little piece here that's going to connect my throttle mechanism to this kickdown mechanism. So obviously I needed to extend it out. So what I did is I cut out of a piece of flat bar the general shape that I wanted, and then this piece here, I cut that off of the bolt that was holding it to the existing carburetor, and now what I'm going to do is weld it in place. So I'm going to weld it in place, test fit it, buff it all down, and then throw some paint on there, and then get a couple bolts to connect it to my throttle mechanism, and then I will have my kickdown linkage complete. And the next thing I will need to do is connect my throttle cable via a bracket that I'm going to need to weld to this bracket. So the hunt continues. So this is the Project Rusty motor swap update. It is now done and the truck is back on the road. In there is the new 350 Vortec V8 from about a 96-97 Chevy pickup. It was rebuilt by a fellow that had a machine shop in Carstairs, and he kept these motors rebuilt on hand for his machine shop, so when a farmer would blow an engine in their truck or a piece of farm equipment, he had a motor that could be ready to be swapped in immediately. So I bought it off of him. Freshly rebuilt 20-year-old motor in a 40-year-old truck. Basically did not go together without some challenges. The first of which, maybe not challenges, but things to make note, is if you're putting a Vortec motor into an old truck like this, the Vortec exhaust manifolds are different than the old school Chevy 350s. They're approximately a 1/16 of an inch or so, a little too small, so the Vortec ones are a little longer. This is the very early Vortec, the 96-97 design. Later model Vortecs had, once again, completely different exhaust manifolds. The exhaust port was at a completely different spot relative to the spark plug and so forth. So you need to know exactly which head that you've got. If you go to the auto wrecker, there's always trucks of that age there, and that's what I did. I just went to the auto wrecker, found a Vortec motor of this vintage, grabbed the exhaust manifolds. The next big thing that I had to do to make it fit was the bracket that holds the throttle and the transmission kickdown cable. Because the Vortec intake manifold is completely different than anything you'd find on an older one, you notice that the intake manifold bolts go straight up and down into the heads. That is something unique to the Vortec heads. The old school Chevy 350s, they went sideways, and there were 6 bolts on each side versus 4 on each side here. So the intake is totally different, and you need a totally different intake manifold for it. Because of that, of course, it uses different intake manifold gaskets. They're actually designed to be a fairly low torque rating, so you don't really have to grunge them that down, 15 foot-pounds or thereabouts for them to hold, so need to be cognizant of that as well. So from an accessory standpoint, I used a brand new rebuilt but old school water pump, so I could continue to use my existing mounting hardware for the alternator as well as the power steering, and have all of the accessory pulleys line up and that sort of thing. So because it's an old school type, the Vortec motors will have an extra inlet coming out of the intake manifold for the cooling. So that's why you kind of see this little bit of of a routing job here that I had to do on the coolant hoses. So essentially the newer trucks, what they would have are different bypass valves. So essentially if it's warm outside, if you don't have your heater on, it doesn't run hot liquid to the heater core. It only runs it when you turn the heat on. So as a result, usually the heater core is going through to the radiator and so forth, so it's completely routed differently. And of course the Vortec motors had a completely different accessory drive system here, which with this additional port actually caused the water pump to spin in the opposite direction from these old school ones. So it would move the water in an opposite manner because the routing was totally different. So to compensate for that, to use the old school one, the extra outlet coming out here, I have routed back into the intake on the pump, on the old school pump that is designed to be an intake from the heater core. So the water pump pumps the coolant into the engine, goes through the block, through the heads, out the manifold, comes out the manifold on this side and goes into the heater core, comes out from the manifold this side and just goes back into the pump. And of course from the heater core comes back into the pump here. So that way it's always routed, there's always water flowing to keep it, so make sure that the motor doesn't overheat and you don't get hot spots in the head and that sort of thing. But it definitely required some creativity with how to plumb that in here. So so that was definitely something that needed to happen. Then the carburetor that I put on, because this is it's kind of a performance dual plane Holley branded Street Warrior aluminum intake manifold. It's got the newer style square intake manifold, which my old Rochester 4-barrel couldn't possibly fit. So I got a QF, a Quick Fuel Technology, which is a Holley product, value-oriented 4-barrel carburetor that has a fuel inlet for both the primary as well as the secondary. So I had to get all of this flex line to use to go down to the mechanical pump to feed fuel into the motor. So the very first QFD one I got, it refused to make a seal between the fitting and the carburetor. It just would not stop leaking. So that caused me 2 days of grief trying to get it to work. At this point what I did is I just got a different QFD carburetor. This one worked immediately out of the box, no issues whatsoever, and I'm sending the old one back to the States for them to either give me my money back or to fix and return to me, and then I'll just sell it on Kijiji. So I'm really happy with this carburetor. It works great. I still have some fine tuning to detail on the carburetor, work on the air fuel mixture a little bit. It's mostly right, but not quite there. Truck's at least drivable, no problem. It works just fine. It just needs a little bit of updating yet. And then because the exhaust manifolds were different, I had to connect my old pipe to the new manifolds, and I still have a little bit of exhaust leakage there on each side of the manifolds that I need to repair. Once again, it's nothing too mission critical. I do need to do it, but it's not a disaster. The truck is at least drivable and usable on a daily basis. The other thing to note if doing this engine swap, the Vortec bolts up to the Turbo 350 transmission with no issues whatsoever. It fits perfectly, just like the old school. However, the flywheel, the flex plate on this motor is different than the one that's on the old school motor. The little circle in the center, the diameter of basically where it connects to the crank, is actually smaller on this motor than it is on the old school one. So you have to use a different flex plate. Thankfully, the engine builder that I bought this from realized that and gave me the flex plate that I needed as well when I purchased this motor. So definitely there was some fabrication involved. It wasn't just a quick and dirty unbolt and rebolt kind of situation. It mostly was, but you need to be prepared to deal with some cutting and welding to make it fit. Mounting brackets were all the same. It was 98% there and swappable. It was just a little bit of 2% that can be a real pain in the arse. So if you don't have a welder, or if you're not comfortable fabricating, cutting up and welding brackets, this is not going to be a job for you. But if you're comfortable doing that sort of thing, it's a pretty easy job. This motor pulls extremely strong. It's a great motor. Definitely, you know, a lot more power than the one that was in there for sure. I'm going to look at getting an aftermarket higher airflow air cleaner as well. I just put this one on because, well, that's what I had and I wasn't spending more money than I had to. However, I had to purchase a plastic riser, a 1-inch riser, because the primary and secondary stuck up way too far on this new carburetor to clear inside of the old air filter, so I had to get a 1-inch spacer. Now, the only 1-inch spacer I could find was a little too small, so I had to cut that, spread it apart with some a piece of sheet metal, and then screw it in. You can't really see it from there, but that's one piece of fabrication that I had to do as well that I forgot to mention. So anyway, that's that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video was at least somewhat helpful if you're going to be attempting a job like this.